Hi everyone, my name's Roger Hallam, this is Reset TV, and we're doing this session on climate, globalisation and the state. So welcome everyone to our conversation. We are talking to, well, it's actually this morning when we're recording this, in the UK anyway. We're talking about climate, globalisation and state, which sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but we're hoping to have a really interesting discussion. In case you don't know who I am, my name's Roger Hallam. I'm one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, and we're having an open discussion today as part of the Reset TV program. The idea here is we're not talking on behalf of Extinction Rebellion. I'm not talking on behalf of the rebellion either. We're just talking as individuals, and we're just going to have an interesting debate around some of the main challenges that we're presented with over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a few preliminary things. I'm hoping it's going to be a fairly relaxed interview. This is, after all, Extinction Rebellion. So, you know, maybe you won't get everything quite right. That's fine. We're just going to explore a few ideas and see where that gets us to. I always like to start off by talking about the climate crisis, because as I'm sure everyone's aware, it's very easy in our relatively comfortable existence to forget that we're actually in the midst of a massive, total off-the-scale crisis situation. And I was talking to a scientist from the IPCC, the UN, last week, who sort of, you know, how they do this in a calm sort of way. He said, well, Roger, we're at 500 parts per million of CO2 equivalent. That's all the greenhouse gases, and that's 2.7 degrees centigrade temperature increase locked in. In other words, he was making clear that the whole idea was staying below 1.5 or even 2 is a little bit of a pipe dream. And this is something that's been coming out from the science, you know, for a good 10 years now, if not longer. And that means something beyond terrible. Another paper that came out recently said that 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial, we're looking at 1 billion people living in areas of extreme heat. And that's always a little bit of a scientific euphemism for mass suffering, hunger, war, migration. And that's just at 2 degrees. And they estimate at 3 degrees, it's going to be another billion, like 2 billion. So it's not good. And everyone around the world is starting to get around to thinking around this. And the big question is, what does it mean for our economy, for our standard of living, for our democracy, for the state? And I think what I want to do in this conversation is try to get us beyond all the abstractions and euphemisms, and also the sort of extremes that it's going to be some sort of anarchist utopia, or it's going to be eco-fascism, or, you know, it's likely to be something quite concrete and in between the two. That's probably the proposition, I think, of our discussion. Okay, and I just want to say also, before I introduce everyone, that as I you know, organise civil disobedience and what have you, and I go and do speeches around the country. And the sense I get is people just want to know some straight answers. You know, it's one thing to go, okay, so this is really bad. The next thing people want to know is, you know, how bad? And then once you know how bad it is, at least you can make a decision to actually cut CO2. You know, if we cut CO2, what does it actually mean? And of course, once people know that it's something concrete, then they're more likely to agree to do it. That's, I think, a big part of why we're talking today. All right, so yeah, there's a few other bits and pieces I want to introduce, but I'm going to introduce our three people. I'm no good at introducing people, so I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and say a little bit about, you know, their general take without talking for too long, and then we'll get on with it. So, Anne, thank you very much for coming on. Do you want to just say who you are?
Yes, thank you very much for having me on, Roger. My name is Ann Pettifor, and I am the author of a book, The Case for the Green New Deal, published in 2019, and was a member of the original Green New Deal group back in 2007-8, together with Caroline Lucas, Andrew Sims, and others. My preoccupation is with effectively with the financial system, the monetary system. I worked previously on sovereign debt, on international sovereign debt. So I worry about the way in which we create huge amounts of credit, which are unregulated, deregulated, and which are not aimed at sustainable activity, simply spewed out there, but which fuel production and consumption and therefore emissions. And so for me, what is absolutely fundamentally important is that we should integrate transformation of the financial system and the economic system in order to be able to transform the ecosystem. And that's my focus.
That's great. So, I think this is a really important area, isn't it, that we need to discuss. Is one of the reasons why nothing's happening is we're tied into this mad growth system, and that's tied into the creation of money, as I think you're saying. So, yeah, we'll be talking about that. So I'm going to go to Anatol next.
Well, I've also just had a book come out called Climate Change and the Nation State, which is mainly about the politics of the struggle to limit climate change. This comes out largely from my experience as a journalist. I was a journalist for the first part of my career. I spent several years in South Asia, in India and Pakistan and Afghanistan. And if you live there, you become very aware of how close some societies or large parts of large societies are to the edge in ecological terms, especially, of course, when it comes to water shortages and when it comes to a rise in temperature and the effects on agriculture. And so before even climate change became a major issue, I was worrying about the condition of South Asia. If you add climate change to that, you are looking at a catastrophic situation down the road, unlimited climate change. So that was the origin of my of my interest in this subject. I then worked in the former Soviet Union. But something that this experience also taught me was that without a strong and legitimate state, it is actually difficult to impossible to get anything progressive or effective done. In places like Pakistan, in India, at least India before Modi came along, you see innumerable progressive laws in any number of areas, for example, in the areas of women's rights and protections, which are simply not implemented because the state does not have the power and authority to do it. And this gave me a very, or rather different perspective on the whole issue of the struggle to limit climate change from much of the ecological camp, which of course is committed to internationalist solutions. And so my book argues that while we should in no way be hostile to international cooperation or international mobilization like that being conducted by Extinction Rebellion, in the end, the point is to get states to act. And for states to be able to act, they also have to be sufficiently coherent and legitimate internally. And also, the point of the book is that undoubtedly, in the struggle to limit climate change, sacrifices will have to be made. People will have to pay higher taxes. People will have to pay higher prices for fuel in the short term. And the question then becomes, how do you motivate people to do that? Because the record has been pretty discouraging when you've actually put it to the vote. So these were the things that came together for me in writing this book.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I mean, since I got involved in Extinction Rebellion, I had the pleasure of talking to a whole bunch of academics and intellectuals. And I think one of the things which has really changed over the last 10 years is, I think traditionally climate change was looked upon as an environmental issue, and it was there in a box over there. And then you had sort of economics, you know, the real stuff, economics, and politics and international relations. And they, you know, they were the main show. And you just had this little irritating thing called the climate. While I think over the last 10 years, it's like the climate has sort of moved into its rightful position as influencing everything and being at the center of everything, including economics, international relations, and politics. And it's interesting, obviously, that both of you and Anatol have sort of decided that, you know, this is the main show, right? You know, this is the future of politics. Basically, depends on the climate, and so, you know, politics needs to be at the center of discussing, you know, what needs to be done. So that brings me on to Paul. If you'd like to say a few words, Paul, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah, like I've been a activist in various ways for 40 odd years or so. Partly as a sort of more traditional activist, head of Greenpeace International, chasing nuclear armed warships and inflatable boats and all that good stuff. Worked on climate change since the late 80s. So I saw this, you know, as being the kind of defining issue for the last 30 years, obviously coming. Leading to writing a book in 2011 called The Great Disruption, which looked at the issues you talked about, Roger, in terms of economic growth and the futility of the idea of infinite economic growth, and why it's impossible in its current form, and always has been an absurd kind of idea. But also looking at how do societies change, and concluding based on my decades of experience in sustainability, but also just looking at other major existential threats historically at the national, personal and global level, that we tend to wait till a crisis hits and then respond dramatically and do quite dramatic and draconian at times things to respond. And so that sort of sums up my kind of worldview, is that climate change is the single most defining important issue of the century. It absolutely poses an existential risk to civilization and humanity. And it's absolutely no surprise that given that scale that we have avoided taking action for so long, but nor should it be surprising if we now treat it like a pandemic and suddenly do extraordinary things very quickly. We're not doing that yet, obviously, but it's going to be very obvious in hindsight and all the stuff that I write about. We look back at this time, people are going to say, what the hell were you thinking? I mean, it was so obvious, so completely all surrounding you. The evidence was so clear. What the hell were you doing to ignore it? Now, that's what we do. That's how humanity tends to behave. But that shouldn't therefore be, oh my God, it's all over, we're going to die. That should be, okay, well, are we going to be ready for that crisis to erupt? Are we going to be ready for that scale of action to happen? And that's very much the focus of my work.
Great. So, yeah, and you know, you wrote this in 2011, right? You were one of the first people to use the what's called the emergency framing, as you might say. And of course, I hate using the word framing because it seems to imply there's some sort of like voluntariness about it. Like, you know, as if, you know, 2 + 2 could equal 5, and you know, it's just another frame that it equals 5 rather than 4. What we're talking about here is raw geophysics, and it doesn't lie and it's not negotiable. So just to start us off, we're going to sort of look at the whole sort of globalization, living standards, sort of economy sort of side of things, and then we're going to go on to state. But I just want you to expand for us, Paul, a bit more on, you know, why is this an emergency? You know, I mean, we've got these two extremes, haven't we, of, oh, it's fine, there's a bit of a problem, we'll sort it out in 2050. And then, you know, everyone then flips over to, oh, it's totally hopeless and everyone's going to die, you know, both of which are an excuse not to think, as far as I can see. So, you know, tell us about the climate emergency. Just bang this out, exactly what we're facing at the moment.
Yeah. Look, I think the key thing to understand in this whole area is that unlike almost anything in history, this issue has an enormous lag between action to fix it and fixing it, right? And so every time we put it off by 1 year, 5 years, 10 more years, the urgency gets greater, and you eventually get to a point, which we got to kind of 10 years ago, when only an emergency mobilisation can have any hope of addressing the crisis in a meaningful way. That was the case 10 years ago. It's obviously more the case now, be more the case in 5 years' time. So what that means is, I still think the best analogy in terms of economic mobilisation is World War II, but now we have the pandemic as well, which is like, no, it's all hands on deck. You don't have a choice. You now have to behave very differently. We're going to dictate what we have to do. And by the way, we're not going to support it, because if we don't, we're going to face an existential threat to our economy, to our existence, to our quality of life. And that's what an emergency really means. It's like, if there's a flood coming at your house, if there's a bushfire coming at you, you don't go, well, I'm not sure the fire's really there. I'm not sure the fire brigade's the right people to respond to it. I'm not sure I want to make that sacrifice. You just do what it takes to get the job done. And that's the framing, to use that word, of an emergency, is you have to do it.
Yeah, and just tell us then, just give a little scenario of the hell we're facing, right? Because, this is another euphemism, isn't it? Climate emergency. I mean, when are people going to die? How much money are people going to have? What's it going to look like for Mrs. Jones in Basingstoke, in 20 years' time, if this isn't sorted? Give us a few actual concrete things. I mean, what could be happening here?
So I think, for example, a food crisis impacting China and India, leading to massive numbers, and I don't mean 50 million refugees, I mean like 1 billion refugees moving around the world. That's going to result in military conflict in many countries simultaneously. Right? It's going to be, the food supply is going to be very directly threatened. Doesn't mean everyone's going to starve, but it does mean there's going to be massive refugee impacts, massive conflict impacts, which are going to affect the global economy in a very dramatic way. So we are going to have that sort of impact. We're also going to see like in Australia here where I live, massive amounts of bushfires, like uncontrollable, at levels we can't deal with. Likewise, flooding in the UK. That's going to become, as opposed to once every 50 years, once every 1 or 2 years. It's going to become a permanent state to see that way. And that means the economic consequence of that means we are all going to suffer, very significant degradation of our quality of life as we currently define it, in terms of financial terms. And we are going to be paying higher taxes, and we are going to be accepting a much higher level of state intervention to get the situation under control. And again, I think the pandemic is a good example. We suddenly changed our behaviour literally overnight, and we'll be doing that again.
Yeah, I mean, billions of people just spend like 3 months indoors. I mean, when was that sort of considered a possibility? And suddenly it's happened. So, I'm going to translate what you just said. So what I'm sort of hearing from you is basically people are going to be forced to go to war. Men are going to be conscripted to go to war. That's coming down the line because of geopolitical chaos, as you might say. Secondly, there's going to be food rationing because there's going to be no food. That's the actuality. You go to the supermarket and we know what that looks like. You can only buy 1 can of beans, right? We've had some rationing already. So people have already got a feel for it. And then, the other main thing is everyone's going to be really poor, right? You're just not going to have much money because of taxation and because the economy is gone backwards in inverted commas. So, that's one of the things I want to draw out in this discussion is these things are going to happen anyway, right? I mean, there's a possibility it might not, and there's a possibility it'll be 10 times worse. But it's in this sort of ballpark. You're poor, you haven't got half the opportunities, there's no travel, you've got wars, you've got social breakdown, you have riots. This is what we're looking at. The sort of thing we're seeing in the States, after 3 months of this sort of crisis. And then the other thing is, it's not going to stop, isn't it? This is what everyone forgets, is it's not like going to be, well, that was the war and it's over now, like World War II. It's going to go on for what, 10,000 years, Oh, okay. And then you throw in the, extinction scenario. So, I mean, I woke up this morning, I was thinking a little analogy of this is, is about talking to a businessman. And we all know people like this, when we start businesses up. and their business is collapsing, and they go into denial, and they go, no, the business is fine, the business is fine. But you know, the longer they run that business, the more and more debt they're going to get into, and it's going to go exponential. And, you know, as night follows day, they're going to go bust. And you challenge them, and they say, don't interfere in my affairs, my business is fine, you know, don't undermine my freedom, don't, you know, tell me I'm not a good capitalist or whatever, you know, businessman. And what you're really saying is, the more that you go on with this business, the more likely you're going to lose your freedom, the less likely you're going to be a businessman, and the more like disastrous it's going to be. In other words, like capitalism is killing itself. So what I want to get away from in discussion as we go ahead is this isn't an ideological anti-capitalist thing on a moral level. We're talking about realism here. You know, if you carry on running something into the ground, you're going to run it into the ground. So that's why I want to sort of come on to then the whole globalization question and the economy question. And there's this big question, isn't there, which I suppose everyone's asking, which is, why aren't carbon emissions coming down? You know, like, it's a problem. Everyone knows it's a problem. I think 80% of the British population wants to see some action on it, and I'm sure it's the same all around the world. But there seems to be something driving it, which no one quite gets their head around. And to be honest, I don't quite as well. So I want to bring Ann in here about if you could try and do an everyday version of, you know, why it's not happening. There's something, there's something driving us on.
Well, thank you, Roger. So I think, well, we could start with an image, really. We could start with Elon Musk, who on the 31st of May, when Black people in the United States were out on the streets, outraged and rioting about police brutality and racism, launched a rocket into space with the intention of colonizing Mars, he said. But in fact, the real intention is to collect rents from future travelers, space travelers, but more importantly, to collect rent on his space rocket from the United States of America's taxpayers, because what he's going to do is effectively hire out his rocket to NASA. And whereas, you know, Kennedy thought of the moonshot as a collective and public enterprise, this is very much a private enterprise, and its purpose is to collect rent, in my view. So if we just have that image in our minds, Elon Musk is part of the 1%. And when we talk about why emissions are not coming down, that is because 77% of all emissions are created by 15% of the population, and the 1% create even more. And they are running the show. They're in charge. They are running the global economy. They're running the global. We gave up as a society. We gave up management of the global economy to the 1% some time ago, back in the 1960s and 70s, even before Reagan and Thatcher. And we effectively said, we think markets are the best at understanding how the economy works and at making decisions in the so-called efficient allocation of resources. And we handed over huge powers to these markets. And these markets are effectively controlled by a very small group of people. And I say that because, you know, you can see the degree of control just by looking at what happens at in Wall Street and B, Silicon Valley. So here, this is where the 1% live, and they are the ones running the show right now. They're the ones who are building rockets, building cars, consuming massively, and building big platforms such as Amazon for the purpose of consumption, for the purposes of fueling consumption. And they're aided and abetted by Wall Street banks, and indeed by the Federal Reserve. Our own central banks are now complicit in this process of enabling the creation of credit to finance all this massive expansion. Again, credit which is largely unregulated and not managed, certainly not managed by public authority. So we have a very big problem. And for me, the answer is not to clobber the 85%, but to go after the 15%. And that's to an extent what is happening in the United States right now, is that the people have risen up, and it may not be entirely coherent, but they're very, very angry. And they're very, very angry because they know they've been done down, not just in this last period through the pandemic, but way back through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries under slavery. So we have this situation where, you know, we have this uprising against what people instinctively know is a deeply unjust and unfair system. But what we lack, if you like, is political leadership of that uprising. That uprising lacks political leadership. You know, the Green Party hasn't managed to break through, if you like. And many Greens really don't like political activity. They find it very unpleasant. And it is indeed very unpleasant because it means engaging with the state. And the state is in control of violence, if you like, of systems of repression. So that's one gap. Social democracy has effectively collapsed across Europe and also in the United States. And so there is no leadership. And on the right, there is the Donald Trumps and the Modis and the Bolsonaros. And they, of course, are not really capable of leadership, but they are capable of massive disruption. And they are capable of looking after the 1% and of looking after Wall Street. So just in the midst of all this mayhem, the Trump administration has just allowed private equity groups to access something like $400 billion of American pension fund savings for them to use in whatever way they will. So for me, the real problem is that we have failed to focus on the 1%, and secondly, failed to develop the political vehicle and the political leadership that would take power and exercise power over the 1%. And, you know, my book is really the New Deal.
What can I just ask though that, okay, so that's the analysis of what's happened in the past. So, you know, let's look at this question we're discussing, which is, okay, so you come to power, right, in a real world sense, a government that's actually serious about dealing with this free market global capitalism situation. I mean, you've talked about credit controls, is that right? And how that relates to the international economy. And my understanding is basically you say we're going to have to control credit and capital flows. So in a concrete way, what does that look like? And presumably everyone's going to be poorer, right? I mean, that's right. Is that right?
Everyone's going to be what?
Poorer.
Poorer, right. Yeah, no, I mean, there's no doubt that the catastrophe of climate breakdown and Earth systems breakdown is going to impoverish and endanger our lives and our livelihoods. No question about that. But I don't talk about control. I talk about management, really. I talk about managing, first of all, credit creation, because the system that we have, the monetary system we have, is what we need in order to finance a transformation of the economy and in order to finance a transformation of the ecosystem. So we have to manage that credit and manage it in the interest of the many, not the 1%. And we have to manage flows across borders. That's, for me, the most important thing. I'm against using taxation to finance, a green transformation, because I think we've all had the experience that they've had in France, where people feel unfairly that the 85% are being clobbered with taxes to pay for what the 15% are up to. I would rather see us manage capital flows across borders and make the 1% pay their taxes, which at the moment they don't do, simply because we give them permission to move their money out of the country and into tax havens. We give them permission to do that. There is no movement out there campaigning for that permission to be withdrawn. So when we complain about Virgin Atlantic and demanding that the state bail out the airline, when the man himself lives on an island somewhere in order to avoid taxes, that's whinging, which is really our own fault. You know, we have enabled people to behave in that way. We have enabled.
So there's two.
Change that.
Yeah. So there's two. I'm getting like two concrete ideas here, like big policy sort of structural changes. So one's capital controls. So just to explain that, my understanding of that is it stops rich people taking their money out of the country and impoverishing the country. And my understanding, this is often happens when you get progressive or structural changes, is countries are undermined by this process. So that's number one.
It's not just rich people, Rogers. It's Amazon, it's Google, it's Facebook.
It's the companies.
All these big corporations. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, no, that's our money. We're keeping it here, and you will be subject to the state rather than have the freedom to effectively engage in theft, which is to take money from a country and take it to somewhere where the people can't get hold of it. Yeah. And then the second idea, and maybe you can explain it because I'm not totally sure about it, but is this idea of printing money, as I call it, which is just printing money and then giving it to big companies and big banks. And basically that makes them richer. And they use that to raise asset prices of property and what have you. And that impoverishes most people and makes a few people really rich. Is that right? And that's something that has to stop too.
Yes, so it's not printing money. No money is printed. We don't have printed money anymore anyway, but well, we have very few printed notes.
So it's not actually a printing press. It's just...
No, it's a credit creation process. Right. And it's a creation which is a social construct. So the point about credit creation is that it's a good thing. It enables us to promise to pay. It's nothing more than the promise to pay over a period of time. But the problem is that if we don't manage the promises, people could make all kinds of crazy promises, and they do, right? And if we create more credit than we're capable of paying back, we get this huge mountain, this overhang of debt, which we have at the moment. But those who can command credit, who can get hold of it, which are, right now, the Federal Reserve creates liquidity, which, because of the way it's structured, goes straight into the banking system. Those guys can then use that credit to make more money and to make huge sums of money. So we simply have to manage that process so that the credit that is created goes into activity which benefits all, not just the 1%. And honestly, that's a very complicated thing. We don't have time to talk about it at the moment.
Right.
But we did, the point I wanted to make before was that we have done this in the past. Between 1945 and 1971, it wasn't very easy to get a mortgage. You had to go, and prove that you were able to afford this mortgage. Nowadays, you can simply call a number and get a mortgage, or, you can get credit almost effortlessly these days. So we've lived through periods where we managed credit creation and we had stability, and that's known as the Bretton Woods era.
Yeah. So what you're saying is the changes you're suggesting on, historically, from a historical point of view, are nothing unusual. In fact, what we've lived through for the last 30 years has been the aberration, as you might say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The standard situation is the state's in there. The state says to the companies, you're basically subject to our control and you'll pay your taxes because you operate in our country. That's number one. And number two, when we create credit, we're doing that for the common good rather than for the 1%.
Absolutely.
So this has big, this all sounds fairly sensible, doesn't it? And I'm sure most people will go, okay, so, if that needs to be done, that needs to be done. But Anatol, what I want you to comment on is, what does this mean for globalization? Because the whole globalization project since 1989, the whole neoliberal period, has been based upon and not getting those things done, right? So, what does it mean, and what's your view on what needs to happen on the globalization situation?
Well, I mean, the kind of hyper-globalization we've seen over the past couple of generations is going to have to stop. As Anne said, control over capital flows is absolutely critical. And of course, there have been, countries which have been able to do this to some extent. China has done this. But that doesn't mean, of course, as the Republicans would try to fool us into thinking that this means somehow shutting down the world economy or shutting down international trade. Before 1971, I wasn't very aware of things by then, but trade happened, international investment happened, international travel and tourism happened, just not in the completely uncontrolled way that we have seen, you know, in over the past couple of generations. And yes, I mean, I mean, it's funny, I've never been anything else but a kind of mid-20th century social democrat. And I don't see what's wrong with that, actually. I think that remains basically a good and viable model. Now, of course, the counter-argument, though, is that that was based on very different societies than we have today. And so the question then becomes how to, you know, unify our societies again behind, well, really, I mean, like Anne, I'm an extremely strong proponent of the idea of a Green New Deal, and particularly in the context of recovery from the pandemic crisis, which I think gives us a great opportunity in this regard. I mean, I think something that we need to be pretty suspicious of is a line that you hear, you know, from the Financial Times, from the Economist, and even, you know, from some surprising number of activists, that we need to convince some of the big capitalists and corporations, and they will then, and you know, some of them already are acting to limit climate change. And I mean, I try to put the Green New Deal, you know, in the context of capitalist history, and I point out and I describe it as yet another effort, you know, like the original New Deal, to save capitalism from itself. In other words, yes, there have always been a certain number of enlightened and far-sighted capitalists, but, you know, if we'd left it simply to the capitalists to regulate themselves, you would still have children of 8 years old working in coal mines. You know, there has always been a necessity for the state, in modern times a democratic state, but actually in 19th century countries, a bourgeois state, if you like, to step in and regulate capitalism. Now, if states hadn't done that previously, well, when they didn't do that, you ended up with revolution. And, you know, you can say sensible capitalists should have seen that coming. Some sensible capitalists did, but they were not able on their own to act to prevent that. Now, we see, if things go on as they are, climate change will bring the entire world economy, the entire capitalist system down in ruins. So yet again, we need to, the state needs to save them from themselves, if you will.
Yeah. So what I'm interested in here is, you know, what I get asked and what Extinction Rebellion gets asked. You know, if I go on to a program, there'll be a right-wing sort of commentator, and he'll say, well, Roger, what you're suggesting is we won't be able to fly anymore. You know, people won't be able to have, you know, nice jobs, and, you know, and they'll just spiel off a whole bunch of sort of things that we consider. And what I think most commentators, you know, most people answer that question about budging it. And I'm keen on saying, yeah, it does. It does. It means we're going to be poorer. It means, I mean, I think Anne said, I don't know if you don't want to misquote you, Anne, but I think you said something like, people aren't going to be able to fly anymore. You know, maybe some people for some things, but substantially, it's off the agenda, right? And what I think both of you are saying, I mean, I think you said something really interesting there, Anatol, which is the choice here is between becoming poorer or complete social collapse. There isn't the option of neoliberal sort of airy-fairy sort of, you know, magical thinking. And you know, I mean, when we talked before, you said you were a realist, and this is what I understand. What realism is, you know, real life only presents you with a limited number of options. Some options aren't actually available. If you have lung cancer, you haven't got the option of not having lung cancer. You've got the option of different forms of treatment. So this is what I think, you know, you guys need to be saying to the public is, is yes, yeah, you will be poorer. You know, you can be egalitarian or egalitarian, but the whole society will be poorer because you're not just going to have that much stuff. Is that something you broadly agree with, Anatol? You know,
yes,
I mean, because reading between the lines, that's what I hear you saying. You know, a socialist state is going to I mean, socialism in a technical sense, a state which is going to guide the economy, is a state which doesn't have a high level of consumerism in a climate context.
Well, but I'm hoping that the pandemic crisis will lead to a shift in attitudes from this point of view, because, you know, on the one hand, we have become accustomed to limits on our well-being, if you like, that would have been unimaginable only 6 months ago. And, you know, faced with a real crisis, you can accustom people to that. And I think it may also focus us on the difference between, you know, more limited well-being and what is really important, which is health, shelter, physical survival, education. Now, those things have got to be guaranteed. And of course, part of the point of the Green New Deal is precisely to win mass political support for this by guaranteeing to people that their basic human needs and rights will be guaranteed. But the other thing, and this is where, you know, I think the image of wartime is quite important, is that this has got to be accompanied by, if not, you know, equality of sacrifice, that will never happen, but at least, you know, a genuine impression grounded in sufficient fact that the rich, the 1%, are paying their fair share. You know, that this is not, and this was, you know, as Anne said, the catastrophe of Macron's, you know, approach to this issue, that this is, the sacrifices are not simply being loaded onto the mass of the population while the 1% walk away with their money to the Cayman Islands.
Yeah, so, and I think you've put your finger here on the major political conflict of the next decade or so, isn't it? Is the neoliberal model going to try and deal with the unavoidable reality of the climate crisis through further impoverishing the poor, or is a post-carbon social democratic sort of government going to come in which says, right, we are going to need to make sacrifices because that's just the way it is, but the sacrifices are going to be, as you say, broadly egalitarian, and that means that the 1% are going to pay what they need to pay, not least because they, you know, cause most of the problem in the first place. But leaving that aside, I think there's interesting evidence, isn't there, that when there are national crises or wartime periods, social inequality is reduced, and that's the main determinant of reducing social inequality. Because, and this isn't an ideological thing, it's if you need the money, you tax the rich. And of course, we're going to need the money because we're going to be in a massive crisis. So there's a sort of technocratic element to it. And this is the point at which I want to bring you in, Paul, because I sort of called you, I think this probably might be unfair, but it reminds me when you were talking to me about a year ago, I was thinking this guy's like a technocratic revolutionary. In other words, like, you don't really have a big agenda here. You know, I mean, a little bit like Keynes was. I mean, Keynes was a bit of a, you know, I don't think with Keynes he had a big, you know, ideological orientation. He had a pragmatic, how are we going to get through the, you know, the depression? How are we just going to make this work? How are we going to keep the show on the road? And how we're going to do that is, you know, through these policies of the state intervening. So, I mean, you also said to me, I hope you don't mind me saying this, something along the lines of, once a government comes to power that's serious about saving civilization, as you might say, then we're looking at closing down the oil industry in 6 months. So this requires the state. And can you just, you know, moving on to the question of the state, which is another sort of taboo area, isn't it? Exactly how is this going to happen? I mean, Anatol said, you know, when things really happen, you need a strong state. So what does this look like? You know, take us through a 1-year transition and the role of the state in that.
Yeah, look, I'll do that by referring back to World War II and the Ford Motor Company, who was reassured, like literally weeks before the declaration of war in the US, that the government would not intervene, that they were free to act, they could carry on producing, and they had nothing to fear. And then the government said one day after Pearl Harbor, actually, sorry, we're not doing that anymore. You're not producing cars anymore. You're producing what we tell you to produce, and it's starting tomorrow. Right? Now, the point there is exactly where we need to get to, is that if you actually looked at the climate emergency as an emergency, which a government will do before too long, they will say, sorry guys, in the coal industry, nothing personal, nothing against you, but we're shutting you down now, right? And we're shutting down power stations, and we're rationing oil, for example, for car transport by a reduction of 80% overnight. You know, we're doing these things, and yes, there's going to be terrible consequences for you very rich companies, and just bad luck, get over it, because there's a greater interest in here, and the public supports this action. So it is about, for example, saying, no, you can't fly to Spain for a weekend anymore, right? Not can you only do it if you can afford it, you just can't do it, right? And that's the technocratic reality of what you need to do to reduce emissions dramatically. And Jürgen Randers from Norway.
Let me just put my finger on the button here. Basically, you're looking at rationing.
Yes.
You go,
Absolutely.
you know, let's nail it, all right? What
Correct.
we're looking at is, in an emergency, you have rationing. And this is a sociological determinism issue. In other words, it's nothing to do with ideology. When you have when you have to change the economy rapidly, you don't use a market mechanism. You basically use diktat, and you use rationing. You have a certain amount of carbon you can use, and when you've used it, that's the end of it. And then, you know, then the question is whether it's egalitarian or not, of course.
Yeah.
But whether you ration or not that's done. It's just how you design it. Is that right?
Correct. And to Ann's point, isn't necessarily done by ownership by the state, but it's happening through direction of the state. Right, so it's the government, the state saying to corporates, this is what you're doing. You might be the delivery mechanism, but we're telling you what you'll deliver and when. Right, so likewise, Anton's point about the power of the state in a crisis is actually respected and accepted by the people as a whole. But you have to recognise it is about rationing and control and deciding what the market can and can't deliver in the greater good. And that's the mechanism we will use in the climate emergency, and that will shut down a whole bunch of companies virtually overnight and replace them with new companies. You know, if the government says we're all going to, you can't drive an oil-driven car anymore, but you can drive an electric one, guess what? The market for electric cars will boom. Right now, those behaviours are very well accepted and understood in history.
Already happening.
Right? And they're happening today with the pandemic. And we don't say, you know, yes, we argue and we complain and whinge about this and about that. But by and large, if we believe we're facing an existential threat, we will do as we're told, as long as it's done fairly. And Anton made a very important point there, which is that history again shows it won't be equal, but if it's not perceived to be more or less fair, more or less equal, the people will revolt against that. So the 1% can't just have everything because they can afford it. That's why you have to have the state deciding what they can do, deciding what people can do, and making sure everyone gets a fair deal in that process. So universal basic income, for example, you know, could be a crucial part of that process. Reasonable taxation implemented with capital controls to prevent people siphoning their money off will be part of that process. But the state will dictate the behaviours, not in an eco-fascist sort of way, but to saying the market will do the following things. And we've seen that in recent years in South Korea, in China, not just democratic or not democratic countries. We've seen it when the state decides, no, this is the result that we want now, and we're going to dictate that. And yes, that means you can't fly to Spain for the weekend. It means you can't have meat 7 days a week, twice a day, right? But you can.
Yeah.
I mean, you miss on everything. Just how to do it.
So what you're saying is there's a middle way here, even though it's an emergency situation, between, you know, sticking our head in the sand and just carrying on, which is obviously total catastrophe, and some sort of totalitarianism of the right or the left, where, you know, people are basically shot and deported and all the horrors of the 20th century. There's another model, which is, yes, the state is telling people what to do. And I think if I remember rightly, they did tell the motor companies if they didn't move to war production, then their directors would be imprisoned. I mean, it was a serious proposition, right? This wasn't messing about if you want to do it or you don't want to do it. and there's a role for the market there, as it were, but it's substantial state direction. And that's the model that we're looking at in the 20th century in wartime situations. And we've had a taste of it with COVID. But I just want to come, before we finish, onto Anatol, because I think what you're arguing, Anatol, is there's something here about national identity in terms of a motivating factor. And I'm interested in this because, again, this is a little bit of a taboo, is, you know, as soon as people talk about a sense of identity, a sense of national pride or whatever, then we've pushed into the idea this is like eco-fascism. But there's a long tradition of progressive use of national identity, let's put it like that, in the 20th century. And I just want you to comment on that, on how that motivation structure works historically.
Well, this is a point I make in the book, and I link it to the Green New Deal, and, you know, to the whole issue of rationing. You know, I make the point that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Clement Attlee, other great progressives of the mid-20th century were certainly patriots, or call them civic nationalists, if you will. For me, it's the same thing. But it would be absolutely grotesque to describe them as fascists. They were conscious patriots. They saw nothing wrong in being patriots, but that did not mean, you know, that they were totalitarians, or of course that they were supporters of aggressive war. Because I think one thing that we need to, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, the reason I use nationalism so much in the book is that how do you persuade people to make sacrifices, and especially, of course, make sacrifices for future generations? And you would have thought that, you know, simply the issue of one's children, you know, is enough for that, but it doesn't seem to be. And, you know, a concern for the future of your country would seem to me a critical part of motivating people. You know, the fact that if we don't do something about this, yes, I mean, this is a threat to humanity as a whole, absolutely a threat to the planet. We must make that argument. But to get through to people, you can also say, look, if we go on the way we are, England will not exist 100 years from now. Everything, you know, that contemporary generations, the state is working to preserve, will cease to exist. Think about that and act accordingly. So that is, you know, why I make so much use of this.
Right. Let Anne come in before we finish.
Roger, I want to say that I mean, I think that is true, but also, and the truth about both Roosevelt and Clement Attlee was that they were internationalists. And the thing that worries me about some of the talk, some of the left and right nationalism that we're seeing at the moment, is there isn't enough of an understanding or of a commitment to an international framework for resolving these crises. And so the problem with being too nationalist to thinking about ourselves, thinking about England or thinking about Britain, is that actually, you know, the climate is global. And the solution to the climate and also to the financial crisis is an internationalist solution. We can't have capital controls on our own. We have to have it in coordination and cooperation with others. And so, and I feel that there's a risk that there's too much left nationalism around, which has got a blind spot, if you like, for the international nature of the financial system, and therefore the need to transform that internationally. But also, of course, the climate is international. So, and to solve the climate problems, we're going to have to cooperate and work with others. So, you know, I don't think it's possible to be an intense nationalist in a sort of fascist way if you are simultaneously an internationalist. And both those two leaders were internationalists.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this is the tension that we're holding in this in this session today, isn't it? Is there's some nuance here. You know, if we're looking at egalitarian solution, we're not looking at absolute equality. We're looking at something that's substantially egalitarian. If we're looking at sort of, you know, using the motivation and national identity, for want of a better word, we're not saying we're going to some, you know, head in the sand left nationalism or eco-fascism. There's a historical precedence for an intelligent, egalitarian, nation-based internationalism. And it's somewhere in that ballpark that potentially we're looking at to have the optimal output here, you know, without falling into the extremes of revolution, chaos, eco-fascism, left-wing totalitarianism, or of course, the complete head in Neil Sand's business as usual. And the main point, of course, is the longer that we allow governments to continue to do the head in the sand routine, the less likely we're going to have this solution, because the structural forces will you know, move more and more towards the extreme options. And that brings us back to the analogy with the businessman, isn't it? Is the longer you continue with business as usual, the more you're going to produce the exact things that you most fear. And it's that penny drops moment for the nation and for, you know, the business class and for, you know, the whole world to realize the longer we leave this, the less likely we're going to have anything that's vaguely civilized. And what we've done today, I suppose, is look at a realist idea of what a progressive outcome might look like. You know, there's lots of debate still to be had on the nuances of it, but hopefully we're contributing to moving the conversation along. And I'm really grateful for you all, you know, contributing so coherently around it. And yeah, let's hope more people start discussing all this. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, everyone, for watching. Hopefully that was good.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye-bye. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.